This is the next tutorial on the series of Fresnel. So now we are in the last section, and it should be the last tutorial of this series. So if you're just tuning in, you need to go back to the very first tutorial so that you can pick up the base shader and start modifying it from there. If you're just jumping in now, you won't understand what's going on. So now it's time for us to put in the modified Fresnel equation into our shaders. But before we start coloring, I want to talk about this image again. So I was under the impression that this image was originally from some sort of render in a 3D gaming engine. I am sure as to why I thought that it was in a engine, because it did appear in a topic on Unity at some point. But I think there was an image in the Lux thread on Unity that was using part of this image. It was saying how it was supposed to be a representation of the Fresnel effect. And so I believe I found the image that the larger image that it came from on another website and then got confused. In actuality, this image came from this other website, which was created by a professor who teaches Unity over in France, and I think he took this picture or got a hold of this picture somehow. So this is a real image. One of the, I guess, biggest tells that this is a real image is a reflection of the sun here versus the actual sun in the picture. This image just looks a little bit odd. Maybe if this image was a little bit bigger, I would be able to tell what's going on here, but the shadows look very strange. I guess the reason for the extreme highlights back here probably is coming from the solar angle, and that this is not an example of blowout as we approach grazing angles, because we cannot physically, because in the real world we can't get blowout on grazing angles unless we take the angle of the light source into consideration, as we saw before in that other image I showed you of a road around high noon, and the distance, or the viewing angle, is sort of at a grazing angle to the surface, and it was not blown out. So that's just something I wanted to clear up. There are some other things that I wanted to talk about when it comes to specularity in Fresnel. Specular models are not able to capture light that's being scattered in a prism-like effect. So for this specular highlight, there are some light scattering, so we're having some blue tones and some red tones and some yellow tones in here. It's not really possible to fake this. I'm sure you might be able to do it with some sort of image map, but right now I don't think there's any mathematical equation you could put into a shader to fix that. It happens on leaves, and it also happens on things that are leather, and then sometimes we have some odd light behavior on foils. Now back to Fresnel specular highlights. This was a photo of Fresnel. This is how Fresnel should look. This is how Fresnel should look if it was modeled correctly, and this was an incorrect Fresnel. I think what happened here is that the camera is looking at this side of the bag at a very low angle, so it's looking at this bag at a grazing angle, and Fresnel was creating too much of a highlight. It was blowing out too much. It was too strong, so it had to be modified to be more correct with the photo. And so I think that, again, this is related to some of the problems with Schick's approximation of Fresnel and grazing angles. I'm not I believe it was Schick's that they started working with, but I'm pretty sure that this bag was actually done in Blender. There are plenty of cases where someone is trying to use Slick's Fresnel, but it's just not implemented right in the engine, and so sometimes that can be the cause of the error, not necessarily Slick's approximation itself being the reason for all of the problems immediately. So many people are able to use Slicks just fine. However, Slicks, you will start to see a problem with Slicks when you get to some very sharp grazing angles, even if it's not very noticeable and you're happy with it in your game. Okay, so let's get started in editing our shader. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the Fresnel equation in the Beckman shader, and then you can change them in the DGX shader on your own time. I don't think it's necessary to show the changes for both the Beckman and the GGX shader. Also, I would like to remind you about what I said before. You want to be pretty cautious when it comes to what you are planning on putting each of these different types of shaders on, because unfortunately it does seem like the cook-torrance shaders have a little bit of hotness built in when it comes to their geometric attenuation alone. Okay, so bring up your Beckman shader and scroll down to your fragment function, and then scroll down to where it says Slick's approximation. Okay, so what we're going to do is basically just erase all this. So delete it. Change Slick's approximation to something else. Call it mod, or in this case I like to use hacked or hack. I don't remember exactly what the hack looks like off the top of my head, so I have it written somewhere else and I'm just going to paste it in. I built a hack quite a while ago, but it was a hack that originally started off as an alternative Fresnel function that I found on someone else's website that I modified over time. So this Fresnel actually has quite a few magic numbers. So the first line is half, and then we're going to create a variable name. I just called it NL direction, or NLDIR for short. We're going to use the magic number 0.2, and we're going to multiply it by n.l. And then we're going to multiply this by, we're going to add it to a variable. This variable, I believe, has to be going to be rim power in our case. Rim power is the R0 F0 value that is dependent on an object's material. So I'm going to change it to rim power. And this is a size function. It controls the size of the Fresnel. Next, we're going to create another half. And it's going to be half times whatever you want to call this. I'm actually going to call this base. But I think I have a base somewhere else. Do I? No. No, I think I used base in the last Fresnel. So we'll just call this base anyway, and it's going to be 1 minus the dot product of v.h and n.h. I mean n.b. We have v.h up here, and we have n.v here. Next line. The next line is another half, and I named it F0. I'm sure there's a reason for doing that. And we're going to use the magic number 3, and it's going to be 3 plus the roughness modifier. In our case, we don't use highlight, we use shininess. So it's going to be, we're going to change this name to shininess. Times the magic number 10. Well, shininess modified by 10 is not a magic number. The 10 is basically make the changes in shininess more drastic. It's necessary in this function, while up here we want shininess to actually remain a small number even though it's being squared. Okay, so now we're going to make some modifications to the variable base. So we're going to move step it, and it's going to be 1 minus NL direction, which was this variable. And then we're going to use the magic number 1.1. I believe some of the things that I added to this function, some of the things that I added to Fresnel were the roughness modifier. And I believe the next line is also pretty heavily modified. But then, but back to the base modification, we need to put base back here. Now it says the magic number is 1 through 1.4. If we increase this number, the fall off for the Fresnel increases, so that the Fresnel effect reaches further into the object. So the last line is going to be a half 3. Now I want to change the variable name from Fresnel to just plain F, so that it matches the naming conventions of the previous Fresnel function. And so in this case, we're going to be multiplying it by the texture alpha, which is where the specular map should be. And it's going to be times saturate n.l times the color of the light. Well, actually, color is not color of the light. This is a separate color value, times F0 times rim power times the other function base. Now I think we are, let me see what's going on with color, because I don't think that we should be multiplying it by color in this particular shader, because we don't have color up here. We have rim color. So I want to multiply it by rim color. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's take a look at the cook-torrance function. So we have FD times G, and let's leave the FD and G down here to just show you what happens if you leave it in that section. We are actually going to be pulling out this F and putting it down here, but for now, just leave the F times D times G here. Okay, I've gotten some sort of error. So and the error is rim color. So you probably have noticed this already, that rim color was not defined down here. So we need to define rim color. That should solve the problem. Okay, it did. So now it looks like the Fresnel effect is affecting specular entirely. Let's actually change this light position so we can see, so we can actually tell what's going on here. So it appears that we're only getting a specular highlight at grazing angles, which is pretty funny. Honestly, this could be very useful in certain situations with certain types of materials. So as I adjust the roughness, we're having an increase and decrease in intensity of the diffuse lighting. We're also having an increase and decrease in intensity of the specular lighting. But the F0 seems to be what's controlling the intensity of the specular highlights. This really could be useful for a material that only seems to have a highlight at grazing angles but not head on. But this is not what I'm trying to do with this shader. So you can use this particular setup for your own projects if you find it to your liking. I'm going to change the Fresnel color to be similar to the background color because I want it to kind of act as an environmental highlight. Okay, so now we're going to go back and edit this. Okay, so come back to your fragment function. So we're going to pull this F out of here. So just delete it. You don't want to put it here because this is setting up the K value. You could put it in a specular reflection, but we are trying to make Fresnel separate from the specular reflection because if you recall, the specular highlight and the Fresnel effect were separate. So I want to make them separate in the shader. To do that, you don't call the Fresnel effect in anything that's connected to the specular highlight. So all this stuff up here, it goes into the specular highlight because it's part of the specular function. And all of this is connected to the specular lighting function, and we want Fresnel to be separate, so we're not going to reference it in the specular reflection or anything that's connected to the specular reflection like the cook-torrance function. So we could put F down here in final lighting because final lighting is taking the diffuse lighting and the specular reflection. So let's see what happens when we put it down here. But we're going to add it. Well, that created something interesting. Now we have the Fresnel effect facing the lighting. We don't have the Fresnel effect in the shadow. Let me change the direction of this light so we can get a better look at what's going on. We have the Fresnel effect So now we have the Fresnel effect separate from the specular highlight. The question here is the Fresnel effect actually being affected by the roughness of the object? It's supposed to be, but is it actually working is the question. It's kind of hard to tell. So now that we've moved the Fresnel function outside of the specular highlight, let's move the Fresnel function to the very last line of code. So it's still going to be addition. We're going to put it inside of this bracket. Okay, so when you do that, the Fresnel effect becomes a little bit more visible. It also follows along the outside of the character. It outlines the character a lot better once we move Fresnel out into the last line of code. Another effect of doing that is as I increase F0, Fresnel not only gets brighter, but it also gets closer and closer to the center of the object. We can also see that roughness has a greater effect on the intensity of the Fresnel effect. This is how we want Fresnel to behave. We want it to outline the character, only be visible on the side that's facing the light. We don't want it creeping in that much. We want it to have a very intense and short fall off. And we also want to have control over the color of the Fresnel. The reason why we want to have control over the color of Fresnel is that we can change the color to be an average of the environmental color. The Fresnel effect is not completely blown out on grazing angles, but we do have control over the intensity of the Fresnel with F0. We'll also have control over it by changing the roughness value. That the Fresnel effect does not quite blend into the specular highlight. They sort of sit on top of each other. Light colors actually blended a little bit better than what's going on here. To compensate for that, you just decrease the Fresnel color saturation. So let's see what happens when we multiply it together. When that happens, we have Fresnel controlling the specular highlights again. Not good. So ideally, we are going to keep the Fresnel function in the last line of code, and we're going to add it to everything else. You could put Fresnel up here, but we don't get the full features of the modified Fresnel function when you put it up here. We don't really seem to have Fresnel affected by roughness as much as it should be, and we're kind of not seeing the change in the Fresnel effect based on two-step the way it's supposed to. So I want to show you what this 1 through 1.4 does. Okay, so let's change this to 1.0. Gets a bit brighter. 1.4. Not only is it less bright, but it's also confined to the edge more. The smooth step modification, it's basically seems to be changing the intensity, but it also has some effect on the fall off. Truly, I believe it has more effect on the fall off than intensity. And it's up to you to decide which one you think looks more physically accurate. I like to set it on 1.1. You could create another property and use it to change the fall off. You could create another property up here, then use that to control the smooth step. But I don't think this is necessary. However, it is something that you could, do to in your own code if you feel that you would like to have more control over this number here instead of going in and adding it to what you think is best. So this is it for... So this is the last tutorial on Fresnel. And we're very close to the end of this tutorial series. The only reason why this is not the end of the tutorial series is because there are a few more things that need to be covered. One of the things that needs to be covered is the specular map. I've talked a lot about including a specular map, but there's no specular map on this character because there's nothing in its alpha. So I'm going to talk about how you can make one, and we're going to be using two separate programs to do this, to create a specular map that's kind of, it's not how you would traditionally create a specular map. Let's just put it that way. The other reason why this is not the last tutorial is because there is another value or property that I want to add to this shader that allows you to have more control over the specularity and the Fresnel effect together. I want to take out the rat strength property because I don't like it. I want to use a static number, and also I want to use the static number to be able to blend it into the diffuse texture and also make it work with both specular and Fresnel, but that involves having to make some modifications to how the diffuse texture is being multiplied into the final lighting. And it's something that may not be the same for GGX as it would be for Beckman. Also, this tutorial series is probably going to end with I would like to be able to finish this tutorial series and be able to give you a solution for grazing angle hotness, but there really isn't too much of a workaround. I mean, I've tried changing the geometric attenuation, and it definitely helps with the GGX shader. It definitely helps with the GGX shader because the geometric attenuation that I originally had for the GGX shader was the same geometric attenuation that I used for the Beckman shader, and the hotness was extremely high. So I changed it to another geometric attenuation function, and the hotness is the same as it is for the Beckman shader using a different geometric attenuation. But I'm thinking that it's probably the biggest reduction in hotness that you're going to get. I don't think that changing the geometric attenuation for the Beckman function is necessarily going to change the hotness. I think that when I got DGX and Beckman, it looked the same. That's probably the hotness baseline. I might do another tutorial in the future talking about some of the reasons as to why we are having some really high hotness when it comes to the cook-torrance shaders. Yes, I do remember reading something about Disney not liking the excessive hotness, and I think they were trying to go with a different solution, but I wasn't able to necessarily track it down. But one thing that you can do, adding a specular highlight to the shader can actually break up the intense highlights along here. So it's kind of a trick or a hack to fix the hotness problem. So when it comes to Fresnel and specular highlights in general, I'm able to fix some of the problems that I showed you in that paper by Activision, but I'm not able to fix all of it. So I guess the last video is going to be a little bit of an overview and some questions for the viewers of have you been able to solve certain problems. You know, what is your knowledge on the subject? Because these videos are basically about what I've learned about lighting models, and they're based off of information that I've gotten over the past few years. But it does seem like there has been a bit of a change in how lighting models are created when we moved over to Unity 5, and also not just Unity, but some of the other modeling software like Maya and Blender, and maybe even UDK. I'm not too sure about that one, but I did notice this in Blender, Maya, and Unity 5. But I'm just gonna save that for another video. So this is the end of the last video on Fresnel.